So what I'm trying to talk to you about today is about continuous deployment, continuous assurance, continuous compliance. So everyone hears about DevOps. I'm trying to make sure that you think about security, and I'm also trying to take what Alistair said on stage today, which is don't forget about the controls, albeit important, but manage risk. And in my talk and what I'm going to try and show you is the tools and the tricks that you can use of AWS, some further controls and methodology of Accenture, and putting it all together, and how you can do that as a developer to maybe solve those problems before the security person comes down on you, so to speak. So why automate continuous compliance? Who here has played with AWS and 10 minutes later you've ticked a whole bunch of other things and you're like, now what did I do again? Multiply that by many, many people, many, many teams, many, many projects. The ability to use a feature of AWS is a point and click. Amazing, easy, right? The downside of point and click and easiness is who's tracking it? Where's your auditability? Are you doing things in controlled environments? The answer is probably not, right? So you try and get then, Accenture has done this the best, and like some others, well, let's put lots and lots of people on it to manage and monitor, right? Cloud has enabled people now to monitor, to alert, also automatically, as much as you're quick and go, right? You can also make sure that compliance is saying, are you allowed to click go? And of course, if you went to reInvent last year, they talked, GE got up on stage and talked about their move to AWS. And my takeaway was actually not the move to AWS that was exciting, which it is for anyone, but my takeaway was they shut down data centers, and by moving to AWS, they shut down a majority of their P1s and P2s. How? Because, I don't come from a firewall network security background, right? But I can tell you that if I need to change a port from port 80 to port 81, and I need to do that with a large telco in Australia, for example, it might cost lots of money, right? And it might be a few months of time to get that to happen. Put the reverse on, I'm an AWS guy, I've logged on, I change port 80 to 81 and everything breaks. And I've done that in production because somehow I've had control to do that, right? Easy, instantaneous, has catastrophic outcomes. Of course, easy to fix, right? But why would you allow that in the first place? So there's one thing about compliance, which is, to Alistair's point, is it a risk that you're trying to avoid? Or is it a compliance that you're trying to control? Or is it something that you're going to prevent? And, the AWS way, which people will have different opinions. I was talking to Campbell Abbey, a fellow peer of mine at Accenture, and we had this conversation about, do you prevent someone from doing it? Or do you alert, notify, monitor, allow it to happen? And both of those two things I'll try and show you. Just a very simple demo, but powerful, I think, when you use it properly. But of course, if you're improving continuous compliance, you're allowing flexibility in the environment, you're allowing people to use the environment, albeit in a controlled manner, you get a lot more flexibility, you get a lot more control. Like the geosciences guy, right? He was up on stage saying, look at all this cool stuff we can do, but within, I'm sure it's not just sprawl and it hasn't been business accounted for, right? So compliance is the same sort of thing. So you're here today, and you'll hear me say a lot, controls, 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 right? You can never have enough controls when it comes to compliance. I like to say, forget about all the controls, how about I just build properly as an architect, and then I'll worry about the controls later, and I should have most of those mitigated. But the compliance people will say, well, where are my controls? So, I think it was Alistair and a few others that sort of said on stage this morning, 200 or 300 pages of documents that you will have controls for. So I work for Accenture. We're one of those companies that have lots and lots of documents, lots and lots of controls, and we're happy to help audit all of that for you, right? My suggestion would be you do both. You have obviously the people and the method to do the controls and the auditability, but you try and build it in the projects that you're building when you're building, right? So a simple example, which I'll show you today, is who here as a developer has gone, hey, my EC2 instance is too small, I'm going to make it an extra large. I used to work at AWS, and I created a M4 8 extra large. And I left it running for about 4 months before I noticed it on my bill. Why? Because when I left Accenture, I was still a master biller, and it was still going into AWS. And then I did the right thing. I found that I didn't get a bill, and I thought, oh, well, I'll disconnect the master, right? So I disconnected the master and went back to my own simple Visa card. And then lo and behold, I had a declined Visa statement. And I'm like, what is this? So I typically track my Visa card quite well. Anyway, so I woke up in the morning and I had 4 or 5 emails from AWS to say, your payment has been declined. And if you've ever worked for AWS, you know that kind of things happen pretty quickly. So anyway, so I got the bill, and I started calling friends and family at AWS going, what the hell? And they said, well, you know how to work with AWS, go and look yourself. So anyway, so I went in, had a look, and I found 4 or 5, 8 extra larges that I've been running because I left it on for a demo for a customer that I never turned off. Slight awkward. Anyway, so eventually I got that refunded and everything else was all okay. However, my story is, if I'm a developer and I'm allowing developers freedom, they're not going to choose the smallest instance, are they? Right? Typically. Unless they're trying to go to serverless and they're not talking about instances anyway. So the best thing to do is actually say, well, am I allowed to actually use that instance in the first place? So you could do a compliance or a way of control to sort of say, well, this is my allowed series of instances that I'm allowed to use, as a simple example. And if you try and select something else or try and change it to something else, I will use AWS config, which is some of this demo, to say, roughly in about 10 minutes' time, that's flagged incorrect, right? Or I'm actually going to automatically say that's not correct and shut it down. They're the 2 types of controls I could obviously push. So everyone's seen this on the left-hand side. This is not a redo. I'm not here to talk about all the stuff on the left-hand side, except to say everyone knows typically if you've been to a 101 session of AWS or you've had an architect from AWS talk to you, they would have talked all about the left-hand side, and they would have talked about what we control as AWS and then what's the customer's responsibility. So typically the way it works, what you put onto AWS is something that you need to manage and monitor and control. Everything else that AWS provides is something that they obviously have to audit and control. But I would also like to say that if you're in government, and you probably have done this before, I know as an AWS employee when I was there, can you please provide your compliance statements? Can you please send us your reports? Can I walk through your data center, please? Right? I had that probably once every week, if not every day. And I had that for about 3 years, and it gets old quick. But you have those same conversations, and so security obviously is important. But on the right-hand side is Accenture has done a couple of things in the last few years, one of which is they've released an APRA white paper, which is how to run a regulated workload for finance, APRA approved, or help with APRA. You'd obviously, I don't know if you've worked with APRA before, but the idea is don't tell them after you've launched something. That's not a good idea, right? That's just generally not the best idea. So engage them early, but engage someone like Accenture that has a framework, and I can talk briefly through that today. But go through the framework, but also make sure that you're doing all of those controls yourself, right? Because it's the best thing about AWS is they'll say this is a shared security model, but they'll also stand behind it, right? So if you say, well, it's your problem, AWS will happily open this up and talk to you about what's their responsibility, right? So a lot of customers, they might get to 80% of the way of what they think they need to audit, what they think they need to control. Accenture has a great history of auditing as well. So there's an audit team as well as there is a framework and controls that you can follow. Any questions so far? And by the way, have I scared any developers off that this is not a developer session yet? No? All right. So this is kind of the framework in a nutshell of Accenture. Accenture likes to put lots and lots of words. So you'll see that it kind of looks a bit awkward because I've removed lots and lots of words. So it looks a bit vacant, but you'll see that, sort of on the left-hand side is kind of what AWS controls. In the middle is kind of the things that they do. If you haven't, for example, used AWS's event management process, they have a really good 2-week go-live scenario. So roughly 2 weeks before you go live, engage AWS through the IEM process, and they will do a scenario A, B, C, and D on what they call game day, right? Which is launching, and are you going to be okay if something doesn't work, right? They do things like cyber. Are you aware that you've opened your root certificate and put it on the website? And then you move across to the right-hand side, and as you can see, AWS will only go so far. Your skills, if you're a Netflix, if you're an Atlassian, maybe you could do it yourself, right? But I can also say that those companies would engage a third-party auditor as part of saying, am I compliant still, even though I think I am, but am I compliant, right? And that's the manual intervention that you'll still probably need to do for quite some time. But on the right-hand side is effectively a bunch of things. It's where Accenture has skill sets in terms of frameworks and policies and controls, but also services organisations. So we've got cyber security around the world. We do things with black hats, we do things with the white hat communities. We go through things like talking to the banks of Australia and saying, what if we ran a black hat day? What would that look like? And the banks in Australia unfortunately go, oh, don't do that. Right? But these are the sorts of things that Accenture can bring to the table, right? The innovation piece, and of course, again, we've got cyber security, we've got lots of security people around the world, so things like how is APRA relevant to us in Australia? Another one that Accenture has worked on is around the MAS of Singapore, right? The MAS certificate, the certification process, and of course around FedRAMP and around the US governments and things that you heard Teresa talk about. So lots of frameworks, lots of capability. So, as I said, it's all about controls, right? So AWS can give you a whole document and more documents and more and more and more documents, and then that's probably not enough, so you need to then ask Accenture, can you give me some more controls and more documents and more procedures, please, right? And then all of that, you go, now are we still okay? So what this part is, it's around the AWS side, right? So AWS provides you a whole bunch of things. One of the cool things I like is, other than just the typical role-based access control, is the ability to use what's called VPC flow logs. If you know what that is, hopefully some of you are nodding. But apply machine learning to VPC flow logs. So have you thought of doing that, right? So people have, for example, used Splunk. Splunk is a third-party tool. I'm not here to sell Splunk. But imagine using Amazon machine learning to say 80% of the traffic is following the same pathway. And it's the same heartbeats, it's the same type of traffic. And the 81st% all of a sudden did something different. Why don't you use machine learning to auto-correct that? Right? Or, in Campbell Abbey's, and I'm just going to keep pointing to him because I just love picking on Campbell. So, or don't stop it and alert someone, right? Is that someone going to actually know what that 1% is? So, in the whole days of WannaCry and all these sorts of other things, you can't fix it with throwing people at it. You just can't patch fast enough, right? And that's just always going to be the case. And if you've read anything of the black hat and white hat community a couple of weeks ago, again, I'm no security expert, but what I took away from those conferences was the ability to do it continuously. And you need to do it automatically, autonomously, right? These have to happen because humans can't keep up. And again, you want that every quarter. You do need that auditability part. You do need those controls. You do need those people to come through with the checkboxes and tick against the 400 or 500 controls. So, Accenture framework, as I said, if you don't have enough controls with what AWS provides, here's a whole bunch more. So, Accenture provides a whole bunch of role-based access controls around data, where it goes, where it fits, data, classification, all those sorts of things that we can help you with, but then it's where does the flow of the transfer of information go? Where is the data leakage, I guess people call it, but where is all of those controls and those things that can help you make sure that you're managing and monitoring those things? At this point, a lot of this is automatable, but a lot of it usually requires manual intervention, right? So, or manual triggers, manual reports, manual auditing. And because that's not enough, we need to give you some more. So, again, to do a lot more. So around the continuous deployment, continuous integration, continuous pipelines, all those sorts of things, logs, the beauty of AWS is it's all transparent if you want it to be. So in other words, use the transparency of AWS in terms of its features and functions. CloudTrail, Cloud Audit, all of that sort of stuff writes logs and writes ridiculous amounts of logs. And I know which one will win. I could throw lots of people at it to analyse, and that'll be roughly post-mortem. Or I could use something like an AWS config to say, like, my security group was port 80 yesterday, and someone changed it to port 81 today. All right? Alert or autocorrect. And of course, Accenture, platinum sponsor of Splunk and all those sorts of other things that we could integrate with Splunk, with log aggregators, and they have also the machine learning capability in their products. GitHub, everyone knows. GitHub, one of my stories that I used to love is our famous DevOps guy in Australia. I won't call out his name, but he works at AWS, or used to work at AWS. He left. Anyway, within 2 weeks, we used to have this, because I started about 4 weeks before him and I did it, so this is why I laugh. So 4 weeks later, we have this bet, and I was told after it occurred, right? So I had no idea what this was. Anyway, so they all started giving each other $5, and I'm like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, some people lost, some people won. I'm like, what are you talking about? Anyway, what it is your access key and shared key when you put it in GitHub, right? And that was what AWS employees were doing a few years ago, right, where everyone was creating their new environments, their new policies, their new procedures. Lo and behold, as part of their source code repositories, they put their access key and their shared key to their root certificates up on GitHub. Anyway, so our DevOps extraordinaire, he beat me. He did it in 2 weeks. I did mine in 4 weeks. So check it, keep checking, and make sure things like that don't happen. And by the way, AWS now has controls of searching that now as well as a proactive monitor. But, these things happen. And, as I said, we don't have enough controls, so we need to give you more. So this is around the certifiable workloads that you want to run. So, for example, how this plays out, and I'm not trying to trivialise it, but how this plays out is here's a bunch of controls. This is around more of the APRA certification process. All right? So if I was to take a workload and I need to go through APRA, well, AWS has a framework, with their shared security model. Is that enough? Absolutely not, because it says you need to do things in control of your control. So then you can start doing it yourself and do all of the stuff inside of that, and then talk to APRA and say, am I in control? Right? And they'll typically go through a similar report as what this is trying to say, have you got all of these things ticked and approved and processed, and is all of that okay? So these last 3 slides is that, right? And there's a whole document, there's a whole method, and there's a whole service organisation from Accenture to help with that process. And we would do it in conjunction with AWS, and of course we can help with APRA. We've got lots of seats at the tables of different things if that needs to be the case, and of course we can help the customer to do this themselves. So prevention is better than cure. So my theory on life is when you're doing DevOps, allow something to happen, but prevent something stupid from happening. All right? So I would apply some control. For example, if I'm allowing a developer to choose an instance, I'm not automatically going to allow them to go all the way up to an 8 extra large, unless they're from a known tagged reason to do so. All right? So I'll put those controls in place. It's on paper. We would all agree as architects, and then in solution mode, we would actually prove that that all is the case. So I love this picture. It just keeps coming up on my Facebook, so I had to use it somewhere. So the demo is going to be quite simple, right? But the demo is using AWS config. It's not a real-time going to stop exactly straight away the moment that it happens. So I can tell you, when talking to my friends and family at AWS, they jump up and down and say, that's not good enough. Right? I can tell you roughly it takes about 10 minutes for that detection to occur. In a large production, it's going to take longer than that. In a smaller production environment, slightly shorter than that. But roughly speaking, 10 minutes, and I'll show you a quick way of doing it. Right? But in 10 minutes, it'll find it through its natural course of action, and if you've put a config rule in place to say prevent it, well, it's going to do the prevention, or it's going to do the alert. So what I'll do is I'll do 2 things. I'll click go, and the go will detect 1 and fail straight away, right? And that's effectively, the demo is I'm going to show port 443 and port 80, and I'm going to add a pop just because why not add more security ports to it, right? And what will happen is the Lambda will, when I click go, it fires a Lambda script. The Lambda script automatically corrects it back to port 80 and port 443. So it automatically removes the other POP3 line item. On the other one, I'm also going to do another one, which is a well-known problem, and the console has tried to fix it, which is block anyone having, all IPs, open access, so, the quadruple zero access to shared security group number 22, right? So SSH number 22, port 22, and everyone opens it up to the World Wide Web, and it's the easiest way of allowing WannaCry to come in and say hello, right? So the console now says, do you really want to do this? And I know as a developer, I just go, yeah, whatever, just keep going through. Right? In a production environment, you'd probably want to prevent that. So what it does do is this is the one that will take around about 10 minutes, and eventually it'll send me an email, and I've configured it to my Gmail, but you'll see it pop up on my screen because I'm going to use my laptop, that it'll just fail and it'll come up with a fail in the config rule. And me as a user would have to go in and change that. So that's the not fix one. And later in the presentation, I'll show you how to sort of do that EC2 thing. So let's get to that. So just before I go to that, do this, please. Right? So, you heard from Alistair, you've heard from GE, you've heard from a whole bunch of other customers that cloud, is a perception thing, that it's less secure. If you do cloud properly, you'll hear from AWS and you'll hear from other cloud providers that you're meant to secure from the inside out. So what does that mean? That means that all your perimeter firewalls should be the least impacted because you've done everything internally, outward. Right? So outward focused, not inward focused. So you don't start with the firewalls and walk in, you go from outside in. Right? So simple example, a very, very large bank in, let's say, Hong Kong that does lots and lots of trading in, let's say, currencies, right? They had a very, very secure data center. And in fact, it was so secure, they put a glass wall around their data center to show how secure it was. And it was amazing. Bells and whistles, so many colors, very well constructed, beautiful patterns in network design, all irrelevant to me. Anyway, so I was literally sitting on the table, close as you all are, and just watching. And this guy came with a beanie on. He had a little pocket book type of thing, and he just sat next to this other guy. I had no idea who he was. Anyway, the other guy gets up and starts walking into the data center, and he's the guy that's auditing. And it's from a well-known company that does the auditing. Anyway, so he walks in, the door gets open, and in goes the guy with the beanie on. Lo and behold, all these people are taking pictures of this guy with the beanie that's just walking through this very ultra-secure data center. Right? So don't worry about the perimeter, because that should be the least of your worries. You should be protecting inside out. Right? So with that, I'm going to switch to my screen, if I can, please. Not forget my password. You're not getting feed?
No, it wasn't plugged in all the way.
Is it now? Let me know if you got that. You do? Excellent. So this is going to be a rather exciting demo. It's not, but just bear with me. So you notice I'm using my ultra-secure root password. Don't do that. So what I've done is I've gone into AWS config. If you've used this service before, pretty simple but pretty powerful. As I said, you'll see that I've got currently 2 non-compliant rules that are broken. So I'll step you through one. If you've been through this, show of hands if you've used AWS config, by the way. A few of you. Please start using it. It's really important. So rules, very simply put, this is my compliant rule, because what it does is it auto-corrects the security group, and then, of course, because it's corrected back to what it should be, it's continuously compliant. So what it does is it looks for configuration changes. So if I've gone into a security group and I've gone change port 80 to 81 or added a new port, it's basically firing a configuration change, simple. It's going into a security group, which you'll see resource types, and you'll see that I've used one security group because I don't want it to do everything. So I've used one security group to check. So pretty simple, but it fires a Lambda script, and that Lambda script says what is my port and configuration that I'm meant to use. And from there, I'm then going to check and revalidate it and put it back. So it's currently compliant, as you will see. So I'm just going to quickly switch across. As I said, bear with me, it's super exciting. All right, so nothing special here, no tricks. And I add as I said, I'll do a pop just because it's here. And I'm going to do exactly what I told you not to do. Right, so very simple, security group straight away is in action, right? So that's the difference of AWS. It automatically happens, and this could obviously break everything if that's what you're allowing to do. So controls is one thing on paper, compliance and therefore control is probably that next level that everyone needs to get to, because this shouldn't happen, right? So I've come in, I've changed the security group. I'm now going back to config to show you. I'm going to click go. Right, and what it does, I'm just going to click reevaluate, and it'll take a little time, but effectively it'll show up in my email address as this was non-compliant. Which is this one here, evaluation rules started. So some people, I haven't done it, but some people will pass this as an outcome as well, right? So you could see that there's the JSON notation, so you could use this and put it somewhere else more interesting, or programmatically go around it. This is just Lambda saying send an email. You know, of course it hasn't come up the moment that I said it should. So the answer is, and this is still coming I guess, but effectively that's the way of making this rule go straight away, right? So when I click reevaluate, and I'll hopefully wait for it to come up, but when I click reevaluate, that triggers all of the rules to be evaluated, right? So in this case, because it's a Lambda function, it's going to automatically apply, so it fixes it straight away, right? In the restrict SSH one, it does it as a passive one, because I'm just going to go away now and I'll add that quadruple zero back into it to say, well, it's now open, don't do that, right? And that will again occur roughly in 10 minutes time. There'll be an email that just pops up. So I'll just check to make sure it's not occurred yet, and it hasn't. Excellent. Anyway, so that proves my little theory wrong, but that's what's meant to happen, by the way, that you do get that fixed. And in fact, I'll just quickly check here to say that oh, there you go. So it has been, sorry, no. So that, my mistake. So this one actually doesn't send me an email, because it just does the Lambda function and it just says fix, right? SSH1 does the email. So let me change the SSH1. So just very simple. This is one of the default rules that comes with the AWS config. Nothing particularly that exciting. Again, it's looking at a particular security group, which is this one. And it's basically saying you're not allowed to have, which again, you get history and tracking and all that sort of cool stuff. It's not real time. It's roughly 10 minutes of delay. But you'll see all of the stuff that's changed. You'll see where it's connected to and all that sort of stuff. So that's from a proactive or a live version of what your environment is. This is a good way of checking that. Anywho, so we're going to go look at this AWS security group. All right, so this is non-compliant currently. And what if I change this? I don't know. And because I'm impatient, I'm still going to click reevaluate anyway. All right, you can switch back and I'll show you the email that comes up roughly in about 10 minutes. I don't want everyone to wait for the grass to grow. But it's super exciting stuff, isn't it? But obviously it's important, right? So if for example, you're opening up port 80 and port 443, well-known web ports, it wouldn't make sense all of a sudden for port 81 to occur unless it's been signed off and agreed to. So in that way of kicking it out, that probably makes sense. So you could use a very simple Lambda script, albeit very powerful, to just remove that unknown configuration. Likewise, you might use a tagging process, which I haven't done, but you might use a tagging process to override that behaviour, which is to say, I'm an admin person, I'm allowed to make this change, whatever that is allowed to be. Right? So you can use the role-based access through IAM to make all of that occur. And of course, other things, again, why would you want to manually do this, right? So of course you want to set it up right. One of the things that we talk about through the APRA documentation is the ability to relaunch your full production workload every few months, for example, right? So I know a well-known job company, right, that offers, it's a job advertisement company. They redo their full end-to-end data center every weekend. Right? What would happen to architecture that's not meant to be there? Bye-bye. Right? Can you imagine doing that? Like I worked for Sun Microsystems, this is back in early 2000s, and what they did is in Vegas, the very, very senior guy in Vegas just decided to turn all the machines off. And that's what they did. They didn't tell anyone, and this was mission-critical HR systems, payroll, fulfillment, the whole entire company turned off. Right? And he waited. And literally 25% of the machines did not get turned back on. And that's an engineering company, one of the best in the world, albeit not very good sales, but one of the best engineering companies, right, that made great products. Right? But again, they allowed production to creep. So continuous compliance is about preventing that creep or capturing it and alerting and monitoring, right, and going to well-known people that might want that to occur. So a little bit of 101, 201, depending on what level of knowledge you're all aware of. But the first thing that you should do from a practice perspective is separate your development environments from your production environments. So I don't want to overuse this, but effectively don't create an AWS account and use it for all things like I just did, which is root account and do production work in it. So use a AWS production account, use an AWS development account, and separate the two. Everyone knows about blast radius. The Obama administration, one of the best examples, when he was elected president, he ran the worm. I don't know if you know the worm in Australia, but it's that really stupid worm that goes up and down as people are voting based on Liberal versus Labor. It's so annoying. Anyway, so addictive because you can just sit there and go. Anyway, they stopped that in the next iteration. But in the Obama one, imagine all of the US people. There's roughly 350 million people, of which not everyone voted, of course, but everyone could still click go, right? And they allowed that to happen because they thought that was interesting. Anyway, they were doing that, and that, of course, was in the Bay Area, that started in New York. And during this Obama administration, they got an alert that a Category 4, which obviously has come through Houston recently, but a Category 4 was about to whack New York. Or the weather said about to do something in New York. So they were running on AWS at this case, and they decided, because of how AWS works, they moved all of the workload from the queuing service in New York all the way across to California. And they could do that just by a simple endpoint change. So that's the benefit of AWS, but that's the blast radius. So the blast radius part of AWS is the first sort of top line heading is the account structure. So if I'm allowing Campbell, because it's just like picking on him, and I'll pick on Mac as well. So if I'm allowing Campbell and Mac to play in the same account, and Campbell is managing production, but Mac is managing dev, he's got a very easy chance of turning stuff off that he shouldn't turn off. Give them two different play areas, right? So that's blast radius. Next one is, VPCs. So it does not make sense in two reasons, and I'll harp on this a little bit. I'm not an existing infrastructure guy, so if everyone comes to me as an app person, the infrastructure in cloud is no longer telling the app teams how to behave. If this makes sense, the app teams are saying to the infrastructure team, please build the infrastructure this way. And in fact, that's probably no longer relevant because the apps teams are saying, you know what, I'm going to build it myself. Right? So they do a DevOps pipeline, and lo and behold, they get the environment that they are seeking for. But is an ERP system the same as an SAP system? Is it the same as a website? So separate logically where that makes sense, and the next best logical step is your VPC design. Right? That's number 2. Also, don't put production VPC in the same VPC as your development. Right? Again, separation of duties. So separate into development workloads and go through that. No brain stuff, but you'd be amazed at how many people we're able to log on to production, log in using the account, log into the production VPC and turn stuff off. Right? There's also malicious behaviour in that if it's all available to you and you can just start deleting rows out of a database, how do you get it back? Prevent that from occurring, one, through control and regulatory requirements, but two, remove their access. And how you do that? Start with AWS account, next VPC. And again, around that is a security group. My fantastic, exciting demo. Right? Security groups are kind of like your moat around the castle. Right? It's the perimeter firewall. And then, lo and behold, you should use the firewall that's on the operating system itself as well. So, for example, if you're using Oracle Red Hat, use the Oracle Red Hat firewall, then do the security group, then do your VPC. And in fact, you could do NACLs on your VPC before it hits the AWS account. Do all of your role-based access before it exits the AWS system. And of course, you can use CloudFront, S3, API Gateway for those extra layers of defense. Right, so as I just said, extra layers of defense, these are the common ones that everyone knows about. Right? So this is kind of repeating the same thing in a different manner, but make sure that you do use the operating system's firewalls if they have them. Right? Don't just turn them off. Right? So the least privilege. Remember, when you create a new EC2 instance, when you create a security group, guess what it starts with? No rows. So what does that mean? Well, by default, your EC2 instance is the most secure because no one has access to it. Right? The moment you add a security group, well, guess what? You've now allowed an access via a report via an IP address, and that keeps going. Right? Direct Connect. Everyone has probably tried to dabble in VPC design, probably tried to dabble in a VPN connection, and maybe Direct Connect connection. I would always overemphasize you need 2 routes to your data center. Right? So in the world of single points of failure, your network becomes your biggest threat to things not working. Right? When it's downstairs in your local data center in your, I run an Ultra 10 machine, if you know what that is, you're older than I am. But I run an Ultra 10 machine under my desk at home, and it keeps my heater warm at night, right? It keeps my legs warm. But I run that, and if I want to do something, well, of course, it's right there and available. But AWS region, well, it's not in Canberra, is it? It's in Sydney. So it's connected via cable. Cable disconnects. Make sure you have 2 pathways. And that's not enough. So have a VPN failover for each one of your direct connects. Another one, which is often something that people don't use. This is a slide to capture some of that. It's not really talked a lot about in the shared security model enough, I think, which is the fact that you need to move data around and it needs to be secure in transit, right, which everyone's heard. It needs to be secure at rest, which everyone's heard. But make sure you're encrypted, right? So a well-known philosophy, having both worked on at Accenture and at AWS, is the whole idea of if you knew that, part of the Patriot Act, although the Patriot Act has expired, by the way. But the Patriot Act was when they were under a terrorist action in the US, they could go to the judicial system in the US and say, this account, we believe, has a vulnerability that we need to check. And they need to, in court in the US, prove what that vulnerability is. Then it disappears and it comes back down to the US and to Australia. And Australia court system has to say, prove it to me. Prove that this account holds that bit of information that's going to have a problem. All right, anyway, so long story short, goes to the judge, and eventually the judge goes, okay, that makes sense. So hand over your data, right? And they can do all of that without engaging the customer. Now, to this day, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not the security guy, but AWS will engage because it's part of their customer obsession. They will tell the customer, right? But why not go one step further? You are the customer. You can encrypt data. You can put it onto AWS encrypted. So AWS has no idea what that data is anyway. So if they're going to handle a bunch of gobbledygook over to the judge in the US, well, they're going to say, where's my access keys, aren't they? And of course, the original client or the holder of that certificate will then appear in court and say, prove that I've done something wrong. So please, everyone in public sector, certify your content before you put it on AWS. It should just be a rudimentary 101 thing that you do. So again, it comes back to the Accenture framework controls, right? These are the 3 headline topics, but one of which is data flow and moving content around, right? Configuration management, I've shown you how to use one of the tools. There's many others. but use tools to help automate that process and use manual labour when the tools don't provide the service. Second to that, you still need to do the auditing. Currently, there's no robot that will provide the auditing compliance report for you yet that I know of. I'm sure they're coming at some point. So, another way of looking at this, layers, right? AWS account, start first, virtual private cloud second, VPC peering, subnets, tables, firewalls. There should be one more in there, which is, encrypt your data, all right? And you'll see here, role-based access control, but this shouldn't be in isolation of the previous slide, right? So you don't do role-based access control when you've got one super account and you've created one role that says I can do everything, i.e. my root account, right? Externalization of keys. So you can use KMS if you know what that is. So KMS has an encryption service that you can use. You can use your own certificate to create this encryption, and then, of course, you can pass that token around that only you, the client, knows about. So I would urge you to all look at that design. Encrypted EBS volumes, you lose about 1% efficiency in total. So if you're not doing it, I ask you why not, right? Encrypt your data, please. Encryption in transit, pass everything through SSH where possible, SSL, certificates, use your own certificates, make sure they're not third party like the new Ticketmaster that, I don't know if you've heard that there was that company starting with V that's been selling all these tickets that are not valid. So that's been reported to the ACCC in Australia, and they were just basically selling everything that Ticketmaster was, but just didn't have tickets. So we move forward. So basically, hydration, right? So the last step of hydration I think is important. Something that I said that well-known job advertisement company does. Try to think of game day, right? Try to do that proactively in your data centres. Why do deployment once of production and then run away from it? You should be proactively deploying production again and again and again and again. It will remove the creep of your design, which is a good thing, by the way. And if you find all of a sudden that things don't work, well, why wasn't it documented? Why wasn't it captured? Why wasn't it, And again, if you're using AWS config, you'll see what that is over the history of what you've changed. So continuous deployment, continuous configuration, all good things, but you also need to be able to audit what you're continually changing, right? So there's the two-speed economy that you need to think about. So again, love this show, but this is the EC2 instance one, right? So this is a pretty simple thing, which is to go into a VPC, and then it says, for this account, what EC2 instance am I allowed? You can have a comma-limited list to say, I'm allowing a T2 micro, a T2 small, and don't allow the extra large. Can I switch back, if that's all right, please? And I might lose my screen. I've got to connect again. Sorry, can't remember my password. Do you have? Yes, you do. All right, so we look at the rules. This one is, as I said, as simple as it should be, which again is saying I'm non-compliant because I've done something I shouldn't do. It's saying, again, configuration change. So when I'm going into an instance and I've changed it to something else, well, that triggers the configuration change. It doesn't have to happen just out of the blue, right? An EC2 instance doesn't change out of the blue. It changes because it's a configuration change, right? So it makes sense to use a configuration change rule on an EC2 instance and a resource identifier. Pretty simple. It crawls through your configuration. It says, what's my instance and what is it allowed to be? And it's allowed to be a T2 small. It's pretty exciting stuff. But how it works, again, is I can go into my T2. This account is super exciting. It's got 0 instances running. But it's got one instance, which is a T2 micro. And I've said it has to be a T2 small. So if I change this back to a T2 small, oops, sorry, can't use my mouse. And that's it. 8 minutes later, 10 minutes later, you will see the change. Right? So you'll see here, hopefully, that the security group has been updated, by the way. So it's been fixed, right? So the port 22 is to say, don't allow that, please. Right, you'll also see, and this is the one where it's prevention, or sorry, not prevention, this is just notify. This is monitor, something has occurred, send me an email. It's probably not the best to send to a personal email address, but send to an email, maybe it's an alias of the admin group. Right. The EC2 instance, while that's doing its thing, it will again trigger in my email in roughly, again, 8 to 10 minutes as it crawls through the web. Switch back, please. So, in a nutshell, what I've talked about today is this. This is one of the pretty coloured slides that I should have worked out that's not very pretty at all. So this coloured slide is all of those controls, is the Accenture process, the Accenture methodology, and how to operate when you're in the cloud, right? So please allow development to change continuously. Please allow the configuration to change continuously. Please check that it's compliant continuously. And of course, you'll still need the auditing. There's no robots to replace that yet. Do the automation where possible to do what you think should be done. And of course, there will be always outliers that you will change as your configuration changes. If you use what I've just shown you through the Lambda, through the the role-based access control with the Lambda function and AWS config rules, and you say, this IAM user is a super user, just allow them to do whatever they like, I would still say don't do that. The next level is, because of this tag which says production, I'm going to leave it and don't change it, please. All right? Conversely, you probably want to send an email to say, well, that has been left. Is it still the right configuration to leave? And of course, lastly, you would say, just delete it because it's not right. Right? Don't allow the developer an 8 extra large. So I don't want to harp on this too much, but Accenture and AWS, about 2 years ago, created the AABG group, which is the Accenture and AWS business group. There's a bunch of these people today, and we've got a booth in the hall. Please come and have a chat to us about this if you would like, or about other features and functions. You'll see on the board in the columns about what we've specialised in around those 5 key areas. But, you know, cybersecurity, WannaCry, all of those new things, you know, Accenture's very equipped around that cybersecurity to help with that, right? Around governments, around the federal governments, especially in the US, we've done so much around there. Ahmed is in here talking about Canberra and all the things that are happening in the public sector, so please come and have a chat to us about what we're doing in the AWS space. But it's fair to say that, again, you need the AWS control, you need your own control of what you're doing. Is it best to use your own? You can read through the APRA documents. We have created our versions of what that might be. Please have a look at that. Come and ask for it if you haven't seen it. And of course, there are people that are professional services people behind that can help you implement that and then audit that if that's what you want as well. So again, call to action. Please use continuous compliance where possible. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes back, by the way. So please use continuous compliance where possible. Please look at your controls. If they don't exist, please start documenting your controls. I would suggest documenting after the fact is not so easy. So start using AWS config and discover what you've got in your environment, and that will help you ramp to what you should be doing. But then, of course, look at your controls. Are they relevant? I would suggest probably 90% of the time most customers aren't relevant. So update those controls. Look at Accenture helping you with those controls to say, well, this is a well-known document and process that Accenture's been through and helped customers with that we could, again, help you with. Right? And again, auditing, there's no one yet to replace that, so you still need that auditing function. You might need that if you're using, you know, regulated workloads. You might need a quarter-by-quarter audit report to say you're still compliant. And if you're rehydrating your production environment every week, well, it's the same every week regardless. So you could be calling your auditors every week if you want. And sometimes, you know, as an example, we know this one customer that wanted to give EY a bit of trouble, right? So they literally would do deploy of their production environment every week. And they'd call up EY every Friday afternoon and say, can you please come and do a new audit report for us? Right? And they would say, well, we don't have the people. And you'd say, and of course, EY would always jokingly say, well, that's going to cost you as well. So it was always a fun banter between the two companies, right? But the whole idea was, well, our production's getting rebuilt every week. Do you want to come and test it again, please? Right? And imagine Oracle in this scenario if I'm rebuilding my environment and turning things off completely from 0 to 100%. What would that do to Oracle's auditing and their license team? Thank you. So that's it. Please fill in the surveys. Hopefully I did a good job. I know it's an exciting topic, but and the demos were super cool. I'm happy to share the code. In the presentation, it does have a link. So I didn't make this code up. It's actually from a well-known blog from the security team at AWS. So that's what I kind of regurgitated. You may have seen it, but it's from that. Thank you.